Good evening. Welcome to show number 65 of In Harmony with Nature. I'm your host, Shalom Mandeville. This is being pre-taped on the 10th of October, 1989. With me today is Mr. Gordon Fader. He's a marine geologist, and he's associated with the Geological Survey of Canada and at the Atlantic Geoscience Center, which is located at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. He has been responsible for mapping of the superficial geology of the continental shelf of eastern Canada. And he's also a member of the very well-known Dr. Fournier Commission on the harbor cleanup. And that's a great honor to be appointed to that, I guess.
Thank you very much. It certainly is.
I guess today we'll discuss the marine geology of the Bedford Basin. And why is Bedford Basin there?
Well, I think it goes back a long way, perhaps 350 or 80 million years ago, when the Devonian granites were intruded in the Maguma rocks around the Halifax area, and some associated faults. So we have some northwest trending faults that began the early prehistory sort of Halifax Harbour and Bedford Basin. That was quickly followed by a major river system, which the ancestral Sackville River, so to speak, and that particular river drained across the shelf, and glaciers repeatedly followed the old drainage system, and they were able to scour the rocks and the bedrock down to a great degree, and the last event possibly had meltwater associated with it, and we can actually map the old Sackville River through the basin and the harbour, and greater than 20 kilometers off the coast of Nova Scotia. So it was a fairly large feature and has been there for a long time.
So are you saying the Bedford Basin was at one time part of the Sackville River?
That's right. It was.
That's very interesting.
It was part of the Sackville River, and we can actually, in parts of it, find the old course of the Sackville River. The difference being here, the reason why it is so deep is that during large periods of time, the glaciers actually scooped out more of the bedrock from Bedford Basin than they did in the area of the Narrows and the other parts of the harbour, because the bedrock there was more conducive to the plucking of large blocks during glaciation. And in essence, the basin is what we call over-deepened by glaciation, whereas the remainder of the inlet and the harbour probably was just normal old course of the Sackville River.
Now, how deep is the water in the basin?
Well, the deepest spot in the basin, if we could go to our first slide, you'll see the water is well over 60 meters in the deepest spot, which is, we describe as the area off of Bedford Institute is very close to the deepest spot. It would be about the south central part of the basin. And this is a color map showing the bathymetry of the harbour and basin area, and you can see that definitely throughout the estuary the deepest depths are in the basin, and they're not encountered again until you're well out past Shabukto Head on the inner part of the shelf.
I see.
The particular work that I was involved in started a couple of years ago when we realized that very little geological material existed in Halifax Harbour. And the next slide will show you one of the pieces of equipment that we used a lot to get a handle on the sediments and the distribution of seafloor features in the harbour and basin. This is a Sidescan sonar fish that you see here, and it's devices like that that were used to find the Titanic, and very common devices now used in surveying the seafloor. And the next slide will give you an example of how the system works. And you can see here a ship being towed, or a ship moving through the water. This is on the seafloor looking up toward the surface, and you can see the fish being towed behind the ship on a cable, and the beam of acoustic energy radiating in a pattern from that towed fish. And the next slide will show you a typical example of a side-scan image of a ship. And so this helps people who perhaps don't really understand what side-scan imagery is all about. You can see here that the shadow is white, which is the opposite of light. Using acoustic energy, the shadows are white, and the actual ship itself is the dark image that we see on the screen there. And that's a ship that was found in the Great Lakes, and that's a nice example of how Sidescan sonar works. If I could have the next slide, I'd show you here some of the features that we found in Halifax Harbour that are rather significant, we think, in terms of the cleanup, understanding the geological history of the basin and the processes that have taken place there. And we've highlighted things like shallow gas. Most people don't realize that the sediments of Halifax Harbour and the basin are charged with methane gas. And this is probably the result of degradation of organic material deposited before man arrived on the scene. So it's a natural feature of the harbor, but man is the one who perhaps releases that material into the water column and into the sediments. There's dredge spoils, wrecks, debris of all types, anchor marks, sewage banks, boulder fields, and various types of bed forms and areas of bedrock. Next slide, please. And what I thought I'd do is give you a bit of a tour of Halifax Harbour. This would be similar to if we drained all the water in the basin of the harbour and we were to fly a plane during the early sunset evening hours and were to look at what's on the bottom of the basin. And the character was quite surprising to us, as you'll see in the next slide that we have. This is one of the very common features of Bedford Basin. And in the lower half of the image, you see these two parallel features. Well, we call those the bathtub rings of Bedford Basin. And in essence, what they are two boulder berms. They're piles of boulders, and they literally ring the basin. And in the next slide, I think you can see them as well. And we were able to map these. Here you can see them in the northern half of the upper half of the sonar imagery, these two parallel features. And we think they were formed when Bedford Basin was a lake. Approximately 5,000 years ago, up to that point, the basin was a lake. And after 5,000 years, the sea finally encroached through the narrows and flooded the basin, and we went from being a lacustrine environment into its normal marine environment today. And these were probably formed at the time when it was a lake, and it would freeze over, and the boulders would actually be pushed aside by the ice. So it was a rather unusual find in the basin. And if I could have the next slide. We're going to show you a map made by one of my colleagues at Bedford Institute. This is a map showing the distribution of muds on the floor of the basin. And I think what you realize here is that, and you can see, is there are very large areas of the basin floor that contain mud. But what's surprising is a sort of central feature that looks like there's no mud there. Well, the thing that we found on sonar was that that particular area has a concentration of dredge spoils. And so these are material that would have been dredged out of other parts of the harbor and dumped in the basin. So they're sediments that are not really in equilibrium with the environment, but they have been deposited there by the dredging process. Next slide, please. This is probably one of the slides that really characterizes the bottom floor of the basin. And here you see a whole series of scrape marks, so to speak. These are very similar to iceberg and sea ice marks that you find in the Beaufort Sea and on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. In this case, we think they're probably formed by the World War II fleets that would have anchored in the basin prior to setting sail. And from talking to these people, we find that they anchored, but they used their anchors as speed control mechanisms. When they all decided to leave the harbor, many of them would start up their engines and with dragging their anchors across the bottom, and at some point in time they would pull them up and then they would head out. And of course with the wind as well, they would drift across the bottom. So the whole seafloor, about 90% of the seafloor, the muddy parts of Bedford Basin, looks like that. It's all scoured with anchors. This tells us several very important things, and I think in the next slide perhaps we get a bit of a handle on this. Here's another area of anchor marks as well, but you notice it's a lot lighter toned than the previous slide. And what we think is happening there, that is the input from the modern-day Sackville River. So if we've preserved a whole set of old marks from the 1940s or 30s, we can't have that much sedimentation from the Sackville River into this part of the basin. And indeed, that's what we have found, that there has been very little sediment being deposited in the basin. Most of it ends up in Bedford Bay in the northern part. It's trapped by the bedrock sill of Bedford Basin, or Bedford Bay in the northern part. I could go on to the next slide. This shows in the upper sonogram a very distinct furrow at the seafloor, and this is probably a very modern anchor mark at the seabed. And you can see another series of old patterns behind that, but that's very dominant. So by looking at the relative freshness of these anchor marks, you can get a handle on how much sedimentation has taken place in the basin. And we're able to do this actually through the whole of the harbor. And it really is a useful tool in defining areas where sewage is being deposited, because those areas, the sewage is thick enough to completely obliterate these old marks on the seafloor.
I see.
Can I have the next one, please? Again, this is another prime example of the material coming out of the Sackville River. The very light mottled areas in the seabed we interpret is representing modern-day sediment from the Sackville River, which has spilled out of Bedford Bay and been deposited in the basin. Cores that my colleagues have collected in this area indicate that there's no more than 30 centimeters of sediment deposited from the Sackville River. Next one, please. Features on the bottom. This is another aspect of our survey, and you can see the rectangular feature in the northern part of this profile, and that's an old barge that sits on the seafloor. And I have a particular close relationship with that barge because we actually dove on it with a submarine, a submersible, in 1981 on our beginnings of a program to dive on the continental shelf. We tested the equipment in Bedford Basin, and that is a wooden barge in the center of the basin. And the big, dark, sort of circular area that you see to the right of the image, that we think is an old dredge spoil as well. And if I could have the next slide. Here we see in the upper part of the image, two well-defined targets. And we had identified those in 1987, and this year we were fortunate enough to have the Fisheries and Oceans remote control vehicle, which we deployed in this area to go down and do a test dive and actually find out what these vessels were. And the one in the upper part of the image with the nice dark, very, very hard return, we dove on, and we found that it was an old ship that had been on the Halifax waterfront for a number of years, and I think the Mayor of Halifax at the time had requested to the owner of the vessel or the dock area to remove it. And it just disappeared from the dock, and no one really knew where it went. And it's probably safe to say that it was taken to the basin in one of the deepest spots and scuttled late at night. And so here we are, modern-day detectives, finding someone's sin from the 1930s in the Bedford Basin. There are lots of features on the basin, like old wrecks, and in the next image you'll see an example here of the old boulder berms in the lower part of the image, and right in the center, if you look very closely, you can see a very high reflectivity spot, a white spot. Well, that is an old wreck of some type. We have no idea what it is. It's probably 20 meters in length, and we have a lot of targets that we've identified like that, and we will pass that information on to the archaeological people in Canadian government, and they will have the opportunity to be the first to go and to survey these wrecks through diving and other means to see if they offer any potential for preservation. In the next slide, there's an image here. This is taken off the magazine on the Dartmouth side of the basin. It's very difficult to see, but on the lower image there's a piece of a large airplane, which we know that the image is not very clear. But the reason why we know that is because we have friends who actually dove on that, and it is a fuselage of a very old airplane that ran out of fuel and quite didn't make it to Shearwater and landed in the basin. So as you can see, Sidescan sonar is a very powerful tool for letting you know about the distribution of features and their surface, their shape, and their morphology for the seafloor. And the next image we have here, I'm going to home in on a few other aspects of the debris and wrecks in the harbor and basin. Next one. This is probably familiar to a lot of people, and one of my colleagues and myself, Bob Miller, while we were surveying, we went over this peculiar feature in the Narrows. And we didn't know what it was at first, but our first concept was that, gee, there's something awfully big been built on the seafloor in this area. And through further research through the archives, and this is one of their photographs, we've determined that it was the original railway bridge that connected Dartmouth to Halifax. And the first one was built in 1884, and I think this is the picture of the first one. This lasted actually 6 years, and it went down on September 7th in 1892, and it was lost in a very big hurricane. But it was a railway bridge, and if you look to the distance, you can see a part of the bridge which is a gantry that swings out of the way to allow vessels into Bedford Basin. It was well designed, and it was convex toward the basin to perhaps take the brunt of the ice coming out of the basin in the spring so that it would last. But they quickly built another one, and this other bridge was built in 1892, and it only lasted 18 months. And July 23rd, one nice summer evening, it fell into the basin, and no one really knows why. And if you look at the next image, this is what we found on the seabed. And the linear image that you see cutting across from the upper to the lower sonogram and about the middle of the record is the actual footings on the seafloor of that old bridge. And there is a, to the left of that image on the bottom is a pile of old, what we think are probably water-saturated logs that went into construction in the actual piles. We have some ideas about what happened to that particular bridge, and we think that because our sonogram imagery is showing us that the seafloor is extremely hard. It's bedrock, boulders, that the technique used to build the second bridge was piling, and they actually tried to, or attempted to pile with wooden piles into the seabed. Well, based on our data, that would have been akin to trying to drive a tent peg in bedrock. And so they probably didn't have a very stable foundation. And that's what happened. I think it fell over and probably just in tidal currents, and that was the end of the bridge. We can have a look at the next slide. This is some imagery from the central part of the basin. And the dark areas that you see on this record, we interpret are probably, again, dredge spoils. And so the depositing of dredge spoils in Bedford Basin was probably quite a large aspect of the early days of construction around the harbor. It seemed like a logical place to dump things. It was deep. You didn't have to go out the mouth of the harbor. And so there's a large number of those there. And on that image as well, you can see some linear features. Those are actually anchor chains for the Navy buoys, and we're all probably familiar with the very large Navy buoys in the northern part of the basin, and those are the anchors on the seabed for those buoys. We have the next image, please. This is something that's rather unique on the seafloor, and it's perhaps a bit difficult for your viewers to see, but if we could look in the central part of this image, you will see some what we describe as mottles, some round circular patches, and they're sort of discrete, but there's a number of them there. And then in the next image, I've blown it up, and you can see them a little better. Here again, you see those round patches. Well, we don't really know what they are. If it was on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, we might interpret them as a unique bioherm. In other words, an area where the biological community has concentrated for some apparent reason. In this particular case, this is right at the very edge of the methane-charged gas in the basin. And this would believe us to think that perhaps gas is venting here. So this may be a biological community attracted by the methane venting, or it may be features at the seafloor just associated with venting. And we have to do some more research on that to identify that. But it's a particular unique characteristic of the basin. If I could have the next slide. Again, this is an area in the central part of the basin, and you can see these small dark images with a shadow behind them. There's a cluster of them, about a dozen or so. We have a theory what they are, and we developed that as a result of work we did in the wreck in the basin when the person from the museum came and talked to us about the basin. They said to us, "Did you find any of the tablets in the basin?" And we said, "Tablets? What tablets are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, do you remember years ago on Citadel Hill there was a large war memorial to the Navy people who lost their lives during the war? And as a child, I remember that." Well, those particular tablets had lead in them, and the lead letters were embedded in concrete. And I think the actual statue had been demolished by children over the years picking the lead letters out. So the military decided to build a new one. And that's the present one we have at Point Pleasant Park. And there are sandblasted names of the people who lost their lives. Well, what they did with this old memorial was to deposit it in Bedford Basin. They took it out on a barge, they played last taps on the trumpet, and they threw these things over in the basin. Well, one of my colleagues was standing there at the same moment, and he's been working on the geochemistry of the sediments in Bedford Basin in the harbor, and he said, "Gee, that's where I get a lead anomaly." And it was interesting that here's a team of an archaeologist, a geologist, a geochemist. It took the three of us with our collective knowledge to understand that perhaps these features are a man-induced lead anomaly in the basin, and put the story together and get a grasp on it. So it's a unique combination of talents to bring to bear on these kinds of interpretations. Next image, please. This is probably close to everyone. Everyone has seen the DREA barge in Bedford Basin, and you can see on this image a faint ghost, an outline of something that looks like a ship with cables coming off the corner. That's actually the DREA barge we're looking up underneath it with the Sidescan sonar, and that's in the little bay off of Chinatown near the shore. And a lot of people who are not familiar with Bedford Institute often ask me how I get out to that in the morning, as they think that that's really the Bedford Institute. But, but it's not. And anyway, the interesting thing is you can actually see the moon pool in the center. There's a small dark square area in the center of that feature, and that's the moon pool where the military does their experiments, acoustic experiments. And so that's an image of that particular part of the basin showing the DRE barge as well.
What does DRE stand for?
Defense Research Establishment, Atlantic. And there's a lot of acoustic studies done off of that particular barge. The next image, please. Yes, this is another area in the Narrows area showing very hard seafloor. And I think that's one of the ideas that most people don't understand is that the whole harbor and basin is not just covered with polluted sediments. It's not that at all. There are vast areas of boulders and gravel, and in this particular image you see those dark, hard grounds. They are very, very competent old surfaces of boulders and gravel. They would have been deposited by the glaciers, overridden by the sea, with no sedimentation since then. And so they're sort of pristine bottoms. Although they may have a millimeter or two, perhaps, of material deposited during the summer months, perhaps, but wave action and currents would not keep it there for a long time. So there are large areas of the harbor that don't have the accumulation of polluted muds as most people tend to think. And it is an exciting area. It's not just featureless. There are a lot of features there. We have the next image. And here we're looking at something that's we've been involved in for a while, this large central area with the very high reflectivity image and the acoustic shadow. That's right off the Volvo Pier. And 2 summers ago, a large container boat ran aground on that particular feature and did $10 million damage on the container boat, and it was almost lost, and it wasn't perhaps because it was a double-hull vessel. But this is a large structural high at the seafloor just off the Volvo Pier, and we side-scanned it and had a look at it with our seismic data, and it indeed was a bedrock high with boulders all over it. And what you're seeing on this image is a barge sitting on the actual feature at the seafloor, and they're digging away, and I think they've just finished blasting, and they're actually removing the rubble to lower the depth of this feature to make it safe for vessels.
I see.
We have a look at the next image. This is the really the upper part of Bedford Basin where it joins with Bedford Bay. And if you look on any of the maps of the seafloor in that area, you can see that the seafloor is very, very shallow in that area and very rugged with a lot of islands. And in essence, this is bedrock outcropping at the seafloor that you see here, and it's very narrow passages. That's why very large vessels don't go into Bedford Bay. And those bedrock ridges that you see running across the record are really what keeps the mud from the Saco River in Bedford Bay, and not a lot of it gets out to be deposited in the basin proper. So this is the sort of the upper limit of the basin proper, and the sill for Bedford Basin, or Bedford Bay. If I could have the next image. Here we're looking at, actually we're looking at the container pier in the southern part of the basin, and the long, linear, dark feature is actually the wall of the container pier in the basin at Fairview Cove. And the feature on the left-hand side, that lower image that you see running across the image, is a large container boat, and it's actually unloading at the time when we went by. If we look carefully at that image, I think the thing that scared me a bit about it was that much of the seafloor tends to be eroded in a scalloped kind of pattern. It perhaps looks as if sediment's been removed. And we interpret that perhaps as being the result of propeller wash from large ships that are passing in and out of that particular area. And indeed, propeller traffic is there. Propeller erosion on the seabed of Halifax Harbour seems to be quite widespread, and is certainly a factor that we're going to have to consider in understanding the dynamics of that whole inlet. Is what is the role of propellers in resuspending sediment? If you ever really want to clean up Halifax Harbour, can it be cleaned up, given that that energy is put into the system on a regular basis? Next image. And that's the end of the general images that I had to show you.
Now, how does the Bedford Basin fit into the Halifax Harbour cleanup?
Well, it's part of the system. We surveyed the harbour as well as the basin, and tonight I focused just on some aspects of the basin because it has its own character. Depending on where we were to decide where the outfalls go for the sewage treatment facility, it's possible one may be in Bedford Basin, and as such it was important to understand that as part of the whole estuary, and to get a handle on the geological processes at the seafloor, and to be able to describe those processes. It was necessary to do a regional survey of the whole harbor and the basin included. So that's why we were in the basin as well.
So there's not that much polluted sediment on the basin, I guess you were saying.
Well, I guess it's in a geological sense. Most of the sediment in the basin floor was deposited when it was a lake, and even prior to that, it looks like there may have been some glacial sediments on the bottom. So we're looking at perhaps 20 to 30 meters of sediment that was deposited before man actually arrived on the scene. And from what we can tell from those anchor marks on the basin, it would look like there has not been a lot of sediment deposited. And as I mentioned, the cores of Dale Buckley at Bedford Institute would indicate that perhaps a maximum of 30 centimeters of sediment has been deposited since the founding of Halifax, which is really not a lot.
No.
I mean, if we're looking at 200 years of activity, and the Bedford-Sackville area certainly has seen tremendous development on the outwash plain and the plain of the actual river. And a lot of material would have been deposited perhaps in the 60s when this area experienced its biggest growth. And I would venture to say that probably the amount of sediment coming down the Sackville River overall tends to be less than what it was 20 years ago. And so in relative terms, there hasn't been that much sedimentation in Bedford Basin. A lot of that from the Sackville River has ended up in Bedford Bay. But certainly the sewage outfalls that you see at Fairview Cove and the sediment transport through the Narrows from the Duffield Street sewage outfall, we do see some of those plumes of sediment coming into the basin. The harbor and basin appears to be a two-layered estuary for the most part, which means that the water comes in on the bottom and tends to exit the harbor on the surface.
I see.
And that's pretty well the oceanographic model that we have at this point, and when more data becomes available, we'll have a better handle on the details of the setting.
So there's a little bit of fear if you discontinue the sewer outfalls that it might suspend the sediment again?
Well, I think that no matter what you do with your sewage treatment, whether you have one outfall at the mouth of the harbor or a number of outfalls in the harbor, the resuspension problem is always going to be there. Ship's anchor. Many of the docks, we see a large number of anchor marks right at the dock. We originally thought they may be from propeller washes or dredging, maintenance dredging in the docks, but harbor authorities tell us that no, that's not the case, that several of the large vessels, when they're docking, use anchoring as a technique in rough weather to get their ship nestled into the pier safely. So those anchor marks at the seafloor are continually mobilizing the loose sediment that's on the seafloor. So perhaps if you were to not introduce any more material in Halifax Harbour, with the present traffic that's there, you may be resuspending a lot of these materials.
Well, it's been a very interesting show, Mr. Fader, and I thank you very much.
Well,
and I hope the audience enjoyed this revelation about the Bedford Basin.
Thank you very much.
Bye.